Dr. Guy Diedrich is the Vice President and Global Innovation Officer for Cisco Systems, where he is responsible for the country digital acceleration program across 39 countries. Prior to his role at Cisco Systems, Dr. Diedrich was a Vice Chancellor at the Texas A&M University. Before that, he was the President and CEO of GRA Inc., a software development and consulting company, which he co-founded and grew up from a startup firm, and it was later acquired by a company which was a publicly traded technology firm. He has an interesting PhD from Swansea University on the economics of trust in organizations. He served on executive committee of George W. Bush China-US Relationship Conference and has several position on several profit and non-profit boards. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Guy Diedrich.
Thank you, Vinod, and greetings, everyone. I want to give just 1 minute on what country digital acceleration is. You've heard that term quite often here in the first part of this session. And I want to explain that CDA came about, Country Digital Acceleration, CDA as we call it, came about as a result of us meeting with world leaders and seeing them release these very well thought out, very aggressive national digital agendas. They would work on them for a couple of years, they would announce them to much fanfare, and then they would stall. They really wouldn't go anywhere. And the reason is because they didn't have an execution plan. And so Cisco decided to pull together a process whereby we could help those leaders, help those countries to operationalize and accelerate their national digital agendas. We do this by investment, by putting a national digital architecture together, execution plans and budgets, and as I say, directly investing in proofs of concepts and pilots to help those countries realize the value before they make massive scale up and replication investments. We're now in 39 countries around the world. We've completed almost 900 individual digitization related projects, and those range from everything healthcare to education, smart grid, smart connected cities, cybersecurity, IoT infrastructure, Wi-Fi 6. I mean, the list goes on and on. Anything that you could possibly digitize, I imagine that we have done a project related to it. What we've learned over the last 5.5 years of doing this is that being connected is actually becoming very quickly a fundamental human right. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to steer away from the technology, and I want to talk about the human impact and the economic impact of digitization and why it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative. Now, what have we learned coming out of, as we come out of this COVID-19 year? We've learned that people no longer can get along in society in a fair and equitable fashion without being connected. It is the lifeline to healthcare, to education, to business, to prosperity. And it's only going to expand. We know that now. We're not going back to the way things were. Before we started this COVID journey, about 10% of the US accessed healthcare online as a first point of care. We estimate that's going to be as high as 50% now moving forward. And that means that being connected is a requirement for access to healthcare. Education, I don't know where the rest of the world necessarily is with regard to getting kids back to school, but I know it's been a struggle here, and I imagine it's been a struggle in many places. Having access and equitable opportunity to education is going to require this being connected. And too many times we think, for some reason, that connecting people isn't economically beneficial. And I'm here to argue that that's just not the case. In fact, there is no greater economic stimulus globally that we could invest in than connecting the world. The fact is that more than 40% of the world is not connected. We think that this is just something that is ubiquitous. It's something that we take for granted, but more than 40% has no access. Anil Nair referenced our project in Palgar. That is one of dozens and soon to be hundreds of projects similar that will be connecting villages and connecting populations to the internet for the very first time. You know, I look at the PwC study that recently came out, and they estimate that if we connect the rest of the world, we will instantly pull 500 million people out of poverty. And we will contribute $6.7 trillion to the global economy. That in and of itself is an extraordinary ROI. Take the ethical dimensions associated with connectivity and certainly acknowledge them, but also similarly acknowledge those economic benefits because they're there. And we need to be able to concentrate on them. We need to be able to pull together as government, academia, and industry to deliver on this promise. Now, when I mention that it'll be the ultimate economic stimulus, you know, we're hearing right now all around the world that massive stimulus packages are being introduced, and they're important, but they are very much linked to debt and expanding deficits of countries, investments that will take, in some cases, decades to recover from. Is it necessary? Yes. But those investments need to be made not just in people, but in lifting those people up. And there is no better way to do that than to invest in connecting them to the rest of the world. When we do that, we lift people off of social and government programs. So here I'm going back to the academic world and referencing opportunity costs, right? That is ultimately the notion, the cost of making one decision over another, making one investment over another. And if we choose to invest in connecting people, the returns will last decades and decades. And it's not just the usual suspect. It's not just the big countries that are going to benefit from this. You know, the CDA program that's been referenced that I have the privilege of running. Yes, India was one of our very first countries and actually is one of our most successful. So was UK, Italy, Germany. And yet we also have small countries. We have small developing countries, small developed countries, large developing countries, and large developed countries. All of those four groups, the developing and the developed, are benefiting from digitization. It's not just the big boys. You're going to see countries leapfrogging from their current position to more prominent positions in the world through digitization. Anil referenced a very important point, and that is related to the WEF study. If you recall, he said that 75 million people in the next 3 years will be displaced by digitization, but there will be 133 million new jobs created. That 58 million gap is an important one to acknowledge and address, because we have to reskill 75 million workers around the world, take them from what would be obsolete factory jobs, for instance, into the world of digitization, and we can do that. Similarly, we have to train 58 million net new people in order to fill that gap. And that references things like investing in STEM, getting kids excited about engineering and technology and computer science and all of those jobs that are going to be emerging that need to be filled. What I'm suggesting here in my final thoughts is that connectivity is just a fundamental baseline. It's not something that we need to think about in hindsight. It's not an isolated event. It is the foundational piece of the process of digitization. And it's where we need to start. And here's why. Because Cisco believes, and many in our industry believe, that we're quickly reaching the point where it will be unrecoverable if we don't connect the unconnected. What will happen? Well, Cisco estimates that we're going to be connecting 500 billion things over the next 8 years. 500 billion things. That means the connected are going to get more and more and more. They're going to have greater advantage, greater opportunity. The unconnected will not budge. The unconnected will stay on the ground as we're taking this rocket of digitization into the stratosphere. And what will happen? The unconnected will become invisible. That's a problem morally. That's a problem ethically. It's a problem for governments long term. It's a problem for economies worldwide. The good news is we can address this and we can solve this, and the time is now. Cisco, along with industry partners, the governments of India and other countries around the world, our 39 participating countries, academics who have an absolutely critical role at the table to make this successful, can all come together and solve this problem now. And so that's the call here this afternoon, is to please come together and help us connect the unconnected. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diedrich.